Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is being brought to you by Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project, and our topic today is financing resilient power. To begin with, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants today are in listen-only mode. This means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. You have two options for joining us for the audio portion of this webinar. You can join us using your computer's mic and speakers to avoid toll charges, or you can call in using your telephone. We encourage you to submit questions as you think of them throughout the webinar using the question box on your webinar console, and we will queue those questions up and answer them at the end as time allows. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. Slides and a recording of this webinar will be posted online later today on the web addresses that you see on your screen at Clean Energy Group's website and on our Vimeo page. And with that, I would like to pass it over to Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is the Resilient Power Project Director, and he is going to talk about the Resilient Power Project and introduce our guest speakers today.
Okay, thanks very much, Samantha. This is Todd Olinsky-Paul. Welcome to the webinar. I'm going to do a very brief introduction, and then I'm going to pass this to our two presenters. At the end of the presentations, we will have time for questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I'm going to ask that you put enter your questions into the little questions box on your console. Don't wait till the very end and then start thinking about questions. As the webinar goes on, just enter those questions as they occur to you, and then we'll have a chance to look them over and be ready to answer some at the end. We typically have a pretty good showing for these webinars, so put your questions in and we'll get to as many as we can. So just briefly, CEG and CISA, that's Clean Energy Group and Clean Energy States Alliance, are a nonprofit organization based in Vermont. We work primarily with states to help them to administer their clean energy programs. All over the country we do this, and we also work with federal agencies, we work with developers, work with municipal utilities, and in this case, this is a Resilient Power Project webinar, and it's a foundation-funded project, and the purpose of this is to encourage and support the deployment of resilient power systems at critical infrastructure. That is, to make critical facilities resistant to grid outages that have become very common recently as a result of storms and other natural disasters, and allow the communities to benefit from having those critical systems and services up and running when the rest of the grid is not. So that's our project. This particular webinar is taking a close look at financing these resilient power projects. And so to speak about that, I'm going to turn it over to our two presenters for today. They are Henry Misas and Robert Sanders. Henry Misas is Senior Project Engineer with Bright Power, which is a New York-based energy management firm. He has a lot of experience in building science, including having performed dozens of energy assessments in multifamily buildings and implementing commercial solar projects. He specified over 5 megawatts of solar PV projects and prepared numerous feasibility studies for distributed generation projects, including those using fuel cells, CHP, which is combined heat and power, and energy storage technologies such as batteries. He has received training in solar PV and thermal system design, and he's a mechanical engineer and a multifamily building analyst. And at this time, I'm also going to introduce Rob Sanders, Senior Finance Director with Clean Energy Group. Rob has over 25 years of experience in community and sustainable development, clean energy and energy-related commercial finance. He was formerly the Managing Director of Energy Finance for the Reinvestment Fund, which is a leading innovator in financing neighborhood and economic revitalization. And at CEG, he primarily works on our Resilient Power Project, which I've just introduced. And he recently authored a new report on financing clean, resilient power projects, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So with that, I will pass it over to Rob and Henry.
Great, I appreciate that. Can you hear me? Good. CEG's advocacy for resilient power stretches back to the 1999 Manhattan blackouts that led to the loss of years of cancer and AIDS research when diesel gensets failed at Columbia University and elsewhere. And over the years, extended power outages have regularly occurred. There was the Northeast blackout in 2003. There were Hurricanes Rita and Katrina and Isaac, always following the same pattern of suffering, concern, and ultimately inaction. But I think this cycle of forgetfulness, we call it, was finally broken with Hurricane Sandy in 2012. This time, the conversation did not die down after the storm passed, and I think we see a seriousness now in addressing the need for resilient power, distributed generation, and energy storage. Okay. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'm not getting to advance. Here we go. So I think that's because power outages during Sandy affected millions of residents for extended periods of time and resulted in substantial economic loss to communities. That did not need to be inevitable. Resilient energy solutions could have helped limit those power outages. Hurricane Sandy may have received the most attention in 2012, but extreme weather events caused a dozen other billion-dollar disasters and extended power outages in 2012 throughout the country. Those included tornadoes and wildfires and severe weather events and derechos, windstorms. This slide shows the increasing frequency over the past dozen years of extreme weather events causing major power outages. Again, you can see ice storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, all spiking up to 2012. This slide here, you see the large annual business losses from power outages, $150 billion a year in business losses, with California hit hardest, but also Texas, Florida, Illinois, and New York hit very hard, and every state affected. Our work has a special interest in low-income communities and vulnerable populations. The reason is that low-income areas have more difficulty responding and recovering from the destruction that occurs from extended power outages. They lack income and savings and the kinds of secure jobs and insurance resources that make recovering and surviving these events possible. Low-income and elderly populations are also the most vulnerable to high and low temperatures during power outages based on housing stock and economic means. So we see a critical need for reliable distributed generation and resiliency in facilities that serve communities, including low-income communities. These are hospitals, affordable housing, police and fire facilities, schools, all dialysis centers, all these food banks, grocery stores, all the services that we rely on. And again, diesel gensets have a history of failing the test during extreme weather events and extended power outages. Fully 50% of the diesel gensets that should have supported buildings in New York City failed during Sandy. So to us, clean, resilient power means solar with storage, but not just solar with storage. It's combined heat and power, fuel cells, and other technologies. Within that area of low-income communities, we have a special interest in affordable housing, multifamily housing, and assisted living facilities. And we're looking at integrated battery storage systems combined with on-site generation to help residents shelter in place. So this would be to cover loads like elevators, emergency lighting, booster water pumps, and other charging stations, other critical loads within a building. We're also coordinating with HUD in their Better Buildings Partners program for affordable multifamily housing developers and owners. These are about 80 of the country's best affordable housing multifamily developers and building owners in various cities, whether that's DC or in Baltimore with National Housing Trust and Enterprise Community Partners, or Brooklyn and Bronx with some affordable and supportive housing owners that Bright Power is helping us with, or in Boston with affordable housing and assisted living projects. Our role in this instance, when we get involved, is to provide some very limited dollars for technical assistance for pre-development costs associated with near-term community resilient power projects. So the objectives of this work are to expand clean, resilient power at the state municipal level and identify and support new policy and financing options involved with resilient power. The goal here would be to significantly increase public and private investment for clean and resilient power systems, get city officials to develop resilient power policies and programs and link those to state energy policies and programs, and then be sure that more technical assistance gets down to the project level so that agencies and project developers can get deals done. An introduction to this work of ours can be found at that link. And I would highlight one particular effort here with cities. We took a special look at Baltimore, which asked us how can cities deploy more solar in low-income communities and be more power resilient. This work was built on Baltimore's outstanding DP3 planning process, DP3 meaning Disaster Preparedness and Planning Project, where they surveyed the infrastructure and critical facilities within Baltimore, I should say, and with an eye to how those could be, what kinds of things would need to be done to strengthen those to avoid the damage and economic loss that occurs during extended power outages because of extreme weather and other disasters. So we looked at a number of financing options for that. We talked about how critical community facilities could be served with resilient power, and that full report, it can be downloaded at that link. We're now exploring with Baltimore how a citywide strategy for implementing priority building-related resilient power projects could be done in that city based upon their DP3 plan. Okay, so once a decision is made to pursue resilient power projects, how do you finance it? Well, there are a lot of options for cities and housing and community developers, and they fall into several categories. I've chosen 4 here: bond financing, public-private ownership structures, clean energy financial institutions, which I think have a special opportunity and responsibility in this regard, and credit enhancements. All play a role in making financing available to projects and companies. I'm going to move through a number of these models. On bond financing, I think the thing to remember here is that there are existing tried and true bond tools that are ready to be used to finance pooled resilient power projects. Examples are general obligation bonds. The New York City Comptroller announced recently a multi-billion-dollar green bond program, $25 billion effort to respond to the to strengthen the infrastructure of New York City to avoid the kinds of disruptions that happened during Hurricane Sandy. Those bonds can be used. Energy is a big part of that infrastructure, and those bonds can be used for resilient power projects. 501c3 bonds, these are bonds for nonprofit institutions such as hospitals, universities, multifamily affordable housing community facilities that are owned by nonprofits for their capital improvement projects. Those can also be used for clean energy technologies and for related technologies like solar storage or other resilient power. School construction bonds. For instance, in Baltimore right now, $1 billion is going to be invested in new and retrofitted schools over the next 10 years. That is an opportunity to think about how some of those schools could be could use resilient power for perhaps emergency shelters in certain ones of those schools, which is a common use of school and resilient power. Disaster recovery and resilience bonds, the New York City Green Bond Program is an example. There are other examples as well. Then I would also highlight the Morris model. This is specifically for solar PV and other clean energy technologies as far as how it's been used in the past. It's a hybrid bond model where a public entity issues a government bond and then transfers low-cost capital to the developer for a lower PPA price. It's been used again for public buildings, solar on public buildings, but now is being adapted for CHP, combined heat and power projects for hospitals. It's an interesting model. It's a great way to finance a pool of projects. I would also just mention in passing commercial PACE bonds. These are bonds that are repaid by property assessments that are added to a building owner's property taxes. So it's a source of long-term, well-secured bond financing to do clean energy projects and could be done for resilient power projects as well. Clean energy finance institutions are very important because they can provide integrated financing programs to support new markets rather than just be reactive and wait for financeable projects. They can be proactive and integrate financing programs to support new markets. New Jersey Energy Resilience Bank is a great example of this. It's capitalized with $200 million of CDBG disaster recovery funds, so cities can finance clean, resilient power solutions following Superstorm Sandy. These are for critical public facilities, but initially it's going to focus in the first round on clean water and wastewater treatment facilities that were hit so hard during the storm. But in the subsequent rounds, public housing, schools used as emergency shelters, hospitals, emergency response facilities, all those and others can be financed with us. It's managed by the New Jersey Bureau of Public Utilities and the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, provides loans and grants, also credit enhancement. It's, I think, a model that we should take a look at and evaluate throughout the country for possible replication as it develops. Credit enhancement. These are guarantees, pledge of additional collateral, so you have over-collateralized debt obligations. The cash reserve accounts, subordinated debt, all these different forms of credit enhancement. System benefit charge funds are often used as credit enhancement, so that state clean energy funds provide those dollars for that, as well as green banks often will play a credit enhancement role. A great example of a program that's based on SBC credit enhancement is the Hawaii Green Infrastructure Loan Program. I would take a look at that. It's for solar PV and other clean energy implementation within the state. The Department of Energy has a loan guarantee program, $4 billion in loan guarantees for clean energy and energy efficiency projects. Of the 5 eligible technology areas that are eligible, the first of these that's mentioned is grid integration and storage, microgrid resilient power. I think it's a great opportunity to aggregate projects statewide and regionally. More about credit enhancement and clean energy can be found at in this paper that is cited here. You can find that on the Clean Energy Group website. So, public and private ownership structures. Solar City and other solar companies have transformed residential solar PV by providing lease financing. through third-party ownership and lease financing. I think those have been the drivers for the tremendous growth in residential solar in recent years. I think the question is, can lease financing and third-party ownership accomplish for energy storage what it did for residential solar PV? Well, a lot of companies are banking on that, and solar grid storage and other storage developers are proving the model out now for commercial, government, and nonprofit entities by doing these third-party leasing arrangements that can eliminate upfront costs to the host in many instances, and development and performance risk is transferred to the private developer. I think these companies' business models have benefited greatly by new FERC orders, which now guarantee that competitive revenue streams can now be provided for the provision of ancillary grid services. Ancillary grid services meaning demand response and frequency regulation and other services that strengthens and helps the grid. So those need to be fairly compensated when that's provided, and battery storage does a great job of doing that. Those business models can make it much easier, those third-party financing models can make it much easier for customers to include storage using third-party leasing and PPA financing. Another model is utility-owned and financed microgrids with resilient power. A good example here is the Green Mountain Power's energy storage project in Rutland, Vermont. We're going to do a webinar on this soon. I think there'll be a slide about that at the end of this presentation. But again, this would be solar plus storage in a resilient power microgrid. It's an exclusively solar-powered microgrid. It's the first to provide full backup power to an emergency shelter and a public school, and the first solar plus storage microgrid developed on a landfill or brownfield site. It received federal and state funding, but mostly it was financed by including it in the rate base. So it was the cost of the system is recovered over time from ratepayers who benefit. It's a 2.5 megawatt solar electricity installation, 4 megawatts of battery storage. So a lot of states have stepped up with funding to leverage private investment. More than $400 million in new state funds in the Northeast alone in the last 18 months or so, including Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, New York, and now Maryland. Let me just highlight briefly the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources program. This is Community Clean Energy Resiliency Initiative. This is a $40 million state incentive. By the way, I mentioned that a webinar is going to be about the Vermont. It's going to be about this program, the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources program that's coming up. This is a $40 million state incentive program that's funded with alternative compliance payments. It focuses on critical infrastructure. These are city-led projects involving a broad range of technologies, and it includes technical assistance funding. Some of the round one awards are a community microgrid for school shelters and police and fire facilities, a solar and storage project involving 4 community center shelters in Boston, solar and storage for a fire department in Northampton, and a combined heat and power facility at a regional hospital that can start without any electricity from the grid. In closing, I've been talking about financing in this presentation. It's certainly one key public resource that's needed to make these projects work, but it can't do it alone. It's not sufficient. I think it's important that technical assistance support is provided, that there's support for pre-development costs to help a developer or building owner get to a place where they can make a commitment to investing their own funds in these new integrated systems, and consistent support of policy is necessary. So thanks very much. I'd like now to hand it over to Henry Misas from Bright Power.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rob.
Thanks, Rob. Before we get started with Henry, if you could hang on just a second,
Yes.
I just wanted to say that we have just a few questions so far and a lot of people on the webinar. So I want to remind you to please put your questions in as we go along so that we can have a bunch of good questions to look at the end of this presentation. Okay, go ahead. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Henry.
Yeah. No, so thanks guys for having me and all the attendees for joining. My name is Henry Misas. I'm a senior project engineer with Bright Power. We do energy management for real estate. We're based in New York City. And what that entails is energy auditing, benchmarking, clean energy, energy procurement, and projects. And really what we're trying to do is to make buildings better. We're trying to make them more sustainable and at the same time have a better living environment. So we've been to a lot of buildings. We were founded in 2004. We've been involved in about 1,000 buildings in New York City doing projects and also benchmarked many times more than that. And we're active in all the states in the U.S. And I personally work more on the distributed generation side, solar PV projects, cogeneration, and other technologies, which we'll talk about. But I wanted to give people a sense of the motivation for resilient power. So in basically all the solar PV systems that I've worked in, one thing has been lacking, and that's resiliency, which is a little counterintuitive, but the reality of grid-tied solar PV or standalone solar PV systems is that if the grid goes down, they will also go down. And there's reasons for that, which we'll talk about, but I think we can do better. I think our solar resources, our fuel cells, and all these technologies, they can actually work independent of the grid if needed. So with that, we've come into this space that has a lot of opportunity and a lot of technologies available, and we're at a stage where we can finance these technologies. So we're trying to move ahead with that. So to talk a little bit about which sort of technologies we could deploy, we have things like combined heat and power, which is basically a generator that is very clean because usually they run on natural gas, and they produce electricity and heat. So they're very efficient, upwards of 80% efficiencies, whereas utility power plants can be much lower than that, 40%, 50%, if they don't capture their heat. Energy storage is a very important technology because it enables systems to work. It really, you think about it, something like a car has a battery in it, or even generators. They need batteries to get started. So it's the same with solar PV. They need a battery in order to get started to work if the grid is not there. So we have a lot of energy storage technologies out there, many different chemistries, and the landscape is evolving very quickly. It's very exciting. And at the same time, we shouldn't forget that we have the tried and true backup generator, which can run on diesel or gas, and that's been the standard for emergency. Although I'll say that a backup generator that fails in the middle of a disruption is not resilient, or a backup generator that you cannot supply with fossil fuel, with say diesel in the event of a storm, that's not resilient. So that's really why we're looking at say having the sun power our buildings if there's a major disruption to our electricity supply. And then, if you think of these technologies as standalone systems, it's not really something that will be as resilient and as integrated as it can be. The way that we look at these systems, we want to combine them so that they work together, they work more efficiently, and they have all these complementary features that could work together. So there are control systems out there. This is an example of a company that we work closely with in California. and they have installed a backup system that has solar PV and batteries, lithium-ion batteries, and electric vehicle chargers. So this is a snapshot of their control system working real time, sort of controlling all the flows of energy. And the other thing is, that's the technology on the technology level, but we also have to look at it on the building level. So, different buildings have different necessities, and for resilient power, I guess we're starting with the buildings that need it the most. So, as Rob was saying, microgrids are great for public facilities such as schools, police, fire stations, et cetera, even government buildings. We also have community shelters. We have places where people would go to naturally if the grid goes down, and we want to protect those buildings first, but then also places where people live. Those have very basic and critical necessities, such as water. So if you think of water in New York City, anywhere on top of, let's say the third floor, you're starting to need to boost that water all the way up to, say the 20th floor or even more than that. And that takes a water booster pump, which is a motor that has pretty big power draws. So it's a challenge to provide power to these things, but at this point we can actually do it. Other things that are worth that are usually looked at as critical loads are its lighting, and even heating system. And we're getting into the winter now, and all of my clients have just because it's in the winter, my clients have started saying we want our heat to be protected as well. And you don't usually think of heat as a critical load. So just very briefly, on a technical level, I just want to point out that there are systems out there that are widely used for storage and solar PV, and you can see that usually in a residential level. So on the residential PV market, there are these battery backup systems, but and they're very good systems, very reliable. The only thing with that is that they typically do not power large motor loads or large building loads. They're meant for your refrigerator or your plug loads, your computer. But that's pretty much the extent of the capability of these systems. So in order to power larger buildings, we necessitate these larger components such as bidirectional inverters that are 100 kilowatts or more. These are fairly large equipment, but it's something that you would find that you could put that in a basement in a building. There's definitely space for these things. But there are components that can actually power large motors, elevators, et cetera, or even a whole building if necessary. And yeah, so I want to jump into sort of what creates a resilient power project. So the first thing that that makes it resilient is that it needs to be able to provide critical backup power. So black starting is a major thing, and a lot of the incentive programs, they require that these systems are are able to black start. So, and then another thing that's worth mentioning is that these systems pay for themselves. So they produce savings on an ongoing basis every month, every year, and that creates a project that can be financed because you have cash flows coming in. These cash flows, for example, in a solar PV system, they come from energy savings. You're not buying energy from the grid. You're actually producing it on site for free. So you're saving money on an ongoing basis. With a cogeneration system, you're producing electricity, so you're not buying that from the grid, but you're also producing heat. So you're saving on your therms, on your gas usage. And on the more sort of, on the newer technologies such as energy storage, there's this idea that you can reduce the building's demand profile. So not on the energy side, but more on the power consumption, on the real-time power. If a building consumes 100 kilowatts of power, the utility charges that building for that one-time 100 kilowatt. If that's the most it consumes in 1 month, it'll charge them for that. So there are ways. That's why I say storage can produce savings is by reducing the peak demand of a building. And also storage is something that has become very valuable to utilities. So for utilities, they value storage, and they provide payments for services such as frequency regulation or demand response. So there are many different revenue sources that can be tapped into, and that's critical in order to make a project financed. And sort of to add to that, there's incentive programs out there, because the utilities or the states value these technologies. So there are tax credits, there are all sorts of incentive programs. In New York State, there's a bunch. There's for all these technologies, there's incentive programs, and even in the city, in cities such as New York City, we have property tax abatements or utility level programs that can be tapped into. And on the financing options, just to piggyback a little bit on Rob, there's all these mechanisms out there to provide project financing. The most, the easiest one would be if the owner buys the system, but then the owner would want to, they would either have their cash to just buy it outright, and that would be the best investment possible, or they could obtain a loan, which, if it's coming from a resiliency bank, then it could be a very cheap loan and very attractive. And if you could extend that over a long period of time, such as 20 years, then the project can become very, very attractive. There's also leases and third-party ownerships, and lenders are very open to combining these systems and providing capital for a bigger package. To a bank, if you have a larger project, is better. They can lend out more money. So yeah, so there's a lot of options out there. And I want to give people a sense of what a project looks like in terms of cash flows. So this is a typical solar PV system. A PV system lasts over 20 years, but here I'm showing only 11 because the investment can be recouped in less than 10 years, typically. So here we have your upfront costs, and a lot of that is provided in incentives. And that red bar right there is what needs to be, that's the upfront cost for the customer. And that can get financed. So if you take that red bar out and you repay it over the course of the life of the project, and that's the green bars, your energy savings. In a PV system, those are coming from the energy that you're not buying. And if you're paying that in this case, you're paying that in 7 years. So you can structure PV projects that are cash flow neutral or cash flow positive. A lot of PV systems are cash flow positive. Most that get financed are. But you could have some that are not. You could have some where the upfront cost is higher than what your energy savings are going to be over the course of the years. And maybe there's different reasons. Maybe there's marketing reasons, or there's sort of the aesthetics of the project, or sustainability goals that want to be obtained. So I've seen projects in all sorts of scenarios. But this is more or less how it looks like. Now, if you add storage to solar, essentially you have the same type of project, but if you're using the revenues from storage, you're adding an extra bar, per se, into your cash flows, another source of revenue. You're also adding additional costs up front, but those can get recouped. Now, with storage, the thing is that the cash flows at this point are a little bit less, they're a little bit harder to model, because if they come from demand charge reduction, which we'll get to in a quick second, then you have to reliably reduce the building's demand over the course of the lifetime of the project. The batteries, they may wear out. There's different considerations that come in that have to be taken into account. And to go over the demand charge reduction, this is what energy storage is targeting. This is a very there's a lot of money to be saved in buildings through demand charge reduction. So if we in this graph, I'm showing a typical building, how it looks like in terms of its demand profile, its kilowatts consumed. These peaks are essentially what the utility is looking for, and that's what they get charged on. So if you just reduce this, the peak in the later part of the day here, this is a typical multifamily building. People are coming in, people are turning all their lights on and their TVs. If you can reduce that to, let's say by 100 kilowatts here, you just saved that building 100 kilowatts worth of power in their bill. In New York City, with prices the way they are here in Con Ed, that could be, $2,000 or $4,000 or up just for that 100 kilowatt in 1 month. So you have to add that up over the 12 months, and that's significant savings. That can finance, that can pay off a project in less than 10 years. So I guess Bright Power, we've done projects. We've turnkey projects, so we know what to look for in terms of creating a project. And I want to give people a sense of what things, for a resilient power project, what things we should look out for. All of these things are really important, especially in a market that's sort of just evolving. It's very important to lock these things down. So the project budget, that's how much your system is going to cost, and that needs to include things like feasibility. Can you run a gas line into the building to power a cogen system? Can you site a solar PV system on your roof? All these things at cost, and everything needs to be considered. There should be a contractor that comes in. There should be and takes a look and provides a quote. There should be an assessment that shows where all of these different systems are going to go, and the clearer that these things are specified, then the more accurate the project budget is going to be. And the budget needs to include O&M costs, which are very important for a resilient project that's going to be reliable over the course of 10, 20 years. Then the savings, we talked a little bit about that. I'd recommend that the developer, the project developer, takes a hard look at the data that's available in a building. How much energy do they consume? How much power do they consume? And they do this on as granular basis as possible. So in Con Ed, we can get 15-minute utility bill data. So every 15 minutes, we can see the building demand, and that's the level of detail that we need to look at for for predicting the savings from an energy storage system. And in project finance, the most typical thing that I've seen is that developers need to get the incentive from the state or the utility first. So as the project gets scoped and developed, the developer needs to apply for the incentive and get an award letter. They don't need to have the cash per se, but they need to have a statement from the utility that says, we're going to give you this much money over the course of a time period. And then once you have that, that's pretty much set in stone. That's the most reliable form of funding that you can get. So once you have that, investors are much more likely to take a look at your project and provide financing. And then the last thing that is the newest, most esoteric component is the resiliency. How much is that worth? Nobody really has developed a standard to value resiliency. So it's an open conversation. I would suggest that developers sit down with the building and ask them, how much would you pay to have reliable power for the next 20 years? And if they think of it as an insurance premium, then maybe the project finance is not perfect, but at the same time, they're getting all these other benefits that are harder to quantify, but there's definitely value in them. So those could make a project more economically attractive. And because of all of these components, Bright Power does feasibility studies all the time, and for a resilient power project, that is very important. Just to lock all of these variables down, to take a hard look at utility bills and feasibility and interval data, and go out to the buildings, talk with the building owners, and talk with the building staff as well to make sure that all the critical loads are accounted for. And with batteries, we have to be very careful as to how they're going to operate. So the developers usually do this. They take a look at the building and how the building operates, and then they specify how the system needs to run over the course of 10 years or more. In storage, that has an impact on how well the batteries perform and how long they last. So it's very important to do all of this analysis up front and not wait until the system is up and running, and then in year 5 maybe the batteries are not working. So it's very important to do all of this up front. And the last thing I'll say is that the contractor that builds the system should be involved in as much as possible in the feasibility stage, and also after the system gets built, because oftentimes I've seen emergency generators that are put in a building during construction, but then 5 years later, whoever put it in there is not there anymore. So in a resilient power project, there needs to be a maintenance provider. There needs to be somebody that's there reliably, even if a hurricane passes through New York City again, that provider needs to be there ready to support the project. So yeah, I'll end it off real quick with a potential project that we're developing, where we're getting funding to do a resilient power project such as I've described. This building is called Via Verde. It's in the Bronx. It's an affordable housing development that Bright Power did a solar PV system on. And this project was done 2 years ago, I guess almost 3 years ago, 2012. And it didn't include storage. At that point, it's 2 years ago, storage wasn't even in people's minds when we were developing projects. So it didn't have storage. The solar PV system is there. The building even has an emergency generator, but because it doesn't have storage or integration, if, say, a weather passes and a weather event occurs and there's no electricity, and let's say that there's no natural gas for the emergency generator, then the building shuts off. So this project, we're trying to integrate the generator and the solar PV. We're going to put in lithium-ion batteries, a very promising technology for storage, and those are sort of the components on the right-hand side. We have storage, we have a bidirectional inverter, and also we have an automatic transfer switch to be able to successfully lock the building, isolate the building from the grid in the event of a grid outage to let the system run. So yeah, with that, I'll end it. This is a picture of a solar PV system we did right next to the Hudson River, about 20 stories high. And yeah, the vision here is to do this all over the city and across the states, and to put storage in it so that the buildings are more resilient. Yeah, thanks. My contact information is there. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or want to consider any projects in the future.
Okay, thank you very much to Henry and to Rob. We do have a number of questions here that I will relay to you guys, and you can take them. Either one of you or both of you can jump in on whichever ones you want to jump in on. Before we start with the substantive questions, I want to answer the two that we always get. First, when will this presentation be posted on the website? Usually we get these things posted up within a day or two to our website, and they will be available. It will be available for viewing. And secondly, please share the PDF archive afterwards. I think what is basically the same question, but I'm going to just ask if Samantha could please put the URL up on the screen so that people can see where to go to get the webinar after it's posted, either in PDF form or as a full audio-visual webinar. So with that taken care of, question from somebody regarding I guess the economic case. The question is, I understand that in parts of the country, Solar City can provide competitive solar PV, but is there anyone out there that can provide solar PV plus battery storage that will be competitive with current prices for electricity? If so, what states would that be the case? I think we partly answered that question, that is the case, at least in some areas, but I'm going to put that out. Maybe, Henry, you could be a little more specific, perhaps, about where that competitiveness exists now and where it might be expected to exist in the near future?
Sure.
I would say,
go ahead.
Just quickly, and then Henry, you jump in. Hawaii has made the decision that now is the time it's competitive and it makes sense, and they've done that with long-term financing and simplifying the payment streams through on-bill financing and credit enhancement for that. But in Hawaii, that there is grid parity for distributed generation and storage.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I think that in California there's a very attractive battery incentive. I know SolarCity is targeting that because they have a partnership with Tesla. Tesla is pushing their lithium-ion battery product at a very competitive price. So through SolarCity, they're already deploying it at a residential level, and at a commercial level, they can take advantage of these battery incentives, so they can do that. In New York City, it's not really at this point not feasible, but it's really because the permitting and regulatory, there's a lot of sort of obstacles in the way, but you are starting to see some projects that are taking advantage of that. But it's the battery prices need to come down, substantially, and they will over the course of the next 5 years. The incentive programs are not targeting integrated systems, integrated resilient systems. They're more sort of targeting either solar PV or standalone batteries. So if at some point in the future, I think next year even, we're going to start to see programs that target these combined systems, and you will see more competitive solar PV plus storage that that can compete with the grid. And I think in New Jersey with the PJM market and frequency regulation, that's where Solar Grid Storage, the company Solar Grid Storage, that's where they're doing these sorts of integrated projects already. They're already grid tied and producing power.
Okay, thank you. I'll add to that as well that, a lot of people might assume that the deciding factor is, how good a solar resource you have. For example, in Arizona, you might expect it to be more competitive than in Maine. But that's really not, the top deciding factor. It has more to do with several other issues. One of them is what markets exist in the electricity service territory for the battery portion of the system to access value streams, and you talked about that a little bit. PJM right now is probably the easiest place to put a solar storage system and have it actually earn money by being able to sell grid regulation services. But New York ISO and California ISO are also possible areas for that, and the New England ISO is due to become compliant in March with the relevant FERC orders, and then we should see a better environment in New England as well for that sort of value stream to be accessed by solar and storage systems. The other thing that often has a big role in these decisions is the price of electricity, and how much of the cost of electricity is due to demand charges. So in some areas like New York City, where the demand charges are very high and they can cause your bill to be very high, a solar storage system that reduces your demand charge by just shifting your peak load a little bit can really make a huge difference and save a lot of money for the host, whereas in areas where the demand charges are not so big a factor, that can be more challenging. Okay, next question. How much does available space drive the procurement decision in places like New York City where square feet are expensive?
Henry, when you look at at the mechanical room, how much space are you needing for a battery storage system?
Well, I just went to a building yesterday in the middle of Manhattan, and it's this very large hotel that was renovated and converted into supportive housing building, 600 units or so. They have so much space in this basement. They can fit a little nuclear reactor in there if you want it. I mean, it's really it's their buildings have space. It depends. It really depends on the building. If some commercial properties just squeeze out every single square feet in there and there's no space, but a lot of buildings do, especially multifamily buildings. They have space. It's either up on the roof or in the basement, or even outside in the parking lot. So it depends on how big these solar plus storage systems are. The example that I showed in Villa Verde, that whole package, it's really two refrigerators worth of size, and they have a room right next to the electric room that doesn't have anything in it. So that's exactly where we're going to locate the storage system. So I'm not finding space to be the challenge.
Yeah, I would think space for the PV portion of the system would be more challenging than space for the storage portion in a lot of places. If you don't have available rooftop or nearby area for ground-based PV, does that make? I mean, am I right in that, or is that what you're finding?
Yeah, in New York City, roof space is hard to. Good roof space for solar is hard to find, at least in Manhattan, but Queens and the Bronx and Brooklyn. We do a lot of PV. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one thing that might help in that regard is that virtual net metering is becoming more prevalent, in terms of an allowed way to configure PV. Can you do virtual PV and battery systems at this point, or is there any reason you can't do that?
That's a good question. So virtual net metering only applies for solar because solar can net meter, which means that it can backfeed power into the grid, into this grid, no problem. And there's accounting mechanisms for that. The utility knows exactly how many kilowatt hours are being backfed, and you can virtually account that into another building, even if it's a mile away. With batteries, the moment you put in a battery system, it's the same as a CHP, or combined heat power unit. These systems require a reverse power relay, which means that you cannot backfeed that power into the grid. So you cannot virtual net meter those kilowatt hours. If you have, and then you have the technical thing that if you have a PV system in one building and you have a battery in another system in another building, then if the grid goes down, only the building that has the battery is going to stay alive. The one that has the PV is going to shut off, and that PV is not going to be able to provide power into the building that has the battery. So these resources have to be in the same, really behind the same meter. That's where you draw the line. It has to be in you can have a property that has multiple buildings and maybe one meter, so there's one point of interconnection with the utility. And if you can isolate your property from that, then you're good. Then you could power multiple buildings with the system.
In other words, a microgrid is what we're talking about.
Correct.
Yeah.
As long as there's one point of interconnection with the utility.
Okay. So we're at 3 o'clock. Guys, do we need to cut this off now, or do we have a few more minutes?
Henry, I know you have a meeting. Yeah.
I have a 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Well, then I think we're going to need to end this. I apologize to those whose questions were not addressed. As usual, we couldn't get to all of them, but I will just encourage you to go to our website. There's a lot of documents, a lot of past 2 years of worth of webinars that are archived. There are reports and white papers that you can, and case studies to take a look at. And if you have a burning question, you can always email us, and we'll do the best we can to get back to you. Okay, thank you very much to our presenters. Samantha, do you have any final words?
Thanks, Todd. Yes, I'd just like to draw everyone's attention to the 2 events listed on the screen. We have 2 upcoming Resilient Power webinars on December 3rd and December 16th. So the information for those is on the screen and also on our website.
Okay, thanks very much. We hope to see you all at our next webinar.
Thank you.